It's strange, really, how one moment can change everything, how a single realization, a single choice, can turn your entire world upside down and inside out. I never thought I'd be here, standing tall, breathing freely, looking ahead with hope and confidence. But that's where I am now. And it's all because of the moment I finally realized I wasn't going to stay forever. For so long, I had believed that love meant sacrifice, that in order to keep a relationship intact, I had to put my dreams on hold, my needs on the back burner, and my desires in a drawer locked away somewhere. I was content, or at least, I thought I was. The life I had with him felt stable, comfortable, even if it wasn't exactly what I had imagined for myself. But deep down, I knew something was missing. I didn't know what it was at first. It was a gnawing, quiet discomfort, something I couldn't quite place. I ignored it. After all, I had him, didn't I? He was everything I thought I wanted. Kind, attentive, and seemingly devoted to me. We built a life together, or at least I thought we had. But over time, I started to notice the cracks. Small at first, barely noticeable. A comment here, an unspoken distance there. I kept telling myself that it was normal, that every relationship goes through rough patches, that we would get through it together. But the cracks kept growing. What was once a subtle shift in our dynamic slowly became an undeniable truth. I wasn't living the life I wanted. I wasn't living for me. I was living for him. I had given him so much of myself, so much of my energy, my love, and my patience. I thought that if I gave him enough, he would see me. He would notice how much I was sacrificing, how much I was willing to change, to adapt, just to make him happy. But he didn't notice. He couldn't. Because he had never been the one I needed to please. The person I needed to validate me wasn't him. It was myself. And when the truth finally hit me, it was like a slap in the face. The man I had spent years building my life around, the one I had assumed would be with me forever, didn't value me the way I deserved to be valued. When I needed him most, when I had been ready to give him everything, he pulled away. He became distant, uninterested. And in that moment, I realized something fundamental about myself. I had been waiting for him to choose me, but I had never truly chosen myself. It was the day I found out about his betrayal that everything changed. It wasn't dramatic, no loud confrontations or tearful goodbyes. Instead, it was quiet, a soft, cold realization that hit me like a hammer. He had been seeing someone else. He didn't have to say it. I saw it in his eyes, in the way he avoided my gaze when I asked him if he was truly happy. I had thought I was the one he wanted, but I wasn't. I had spent so long being the person he needed me to be that I had forgotten who I truly was. I had become someone who lived in the shadows of his wants and needs, and I had forgotten to live for myself. That was the turning point. The moment I decided I wasn't going to stay in that place of uncertainty and pain any longer. I wasn't going to let his choices dictate my worth. I wasn't going to wait for him to realize the value of what we had, because he never would. I wasn't going to stay in a relationship that made me feel small, that made me feel like I wasn't enough. I had spent enough time trying to fix things that weren't broken. It wasn't him I needed to change. It was me. And so, I chose freedom. Freedom from the past. Freedom from a love that had never been the kind of love I deserved. And freedom from the need to prove myself to someone who could never truly see me. I chose to be the woman who would stop waiting. I chose to be the woman who would stand on her own, not as someone's partner or someone's lover, but as herself. I wasn't going to stay forever, and in that choice, I realized that I had all the power to change my future. This is the story of how I broke free. This is the story of how I chose myself over a love that had never been the one I thought it was. This is the story of my rebirth. Looking back, it's easy to see where things started to go wrong, but at the time, I couldn't see it. I was blinded by love, or at least, the idea of love. When we first met, everything seemed perfect. He was charming, kind, and made me feel like I was the center of his world. I believed every word he said, every promise he made. We spent hours talking about our future, about the life we were going to build together. I didn't question anything. I didn't need to. I thought that kind of love was all I needed. We were happy, or so I thought. The beginning was filled with joy. We went on trips, spent nights talking about our hopes and dreams, and shared a connection I had never experienced before. But as time passed, the reality of life together began to settle in. The cracks, small at first, began to form. He would get quieter, more distant. Sometimes he seemed like he wasn't even really there, even when he was sitting right in front of me. I told myself it was just the stresses of life, that work and other responsibilities were taking a toll on him. I convinced myself that everything would be fine, that the love we had would be enough to pull us through. I was wrong. It was never enough. The first signs of trouble came when I started noticing his phone more often. He would be on it late at night, texting or scrolling through social media, looking distracted and uninterested in anything around him. At first, I thought it was nothing. I didn't want to overthink it, didn't want to accuse him of anything without proof. But the more I saw, the more I began to feel something deep in my gut, a suspicion that gnawed at me. I had always prided myself on being intuitive, on understanding when something was off. But I ignored that feeling for far too long. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But then came the night I saw the message. It wasn't anything explicit, but the tone was enough to send my mind into overdrive. He had been texting someone for hours, and there was a line that made my heart stop. "I miss you. I think about you all the time." It wasn't the first time I had seen his phone light up with messages, but this one was different. This message wasn't just a casual exchange. This was emotional, and it was directed at someone who wasn't me. I confronted him, my voice shaky but determined. I had to know the truth. He was caught off guard, almost too caught off guard, and he scrambled to explain. "It's nothing, just a friend. Someone from work." But I saw the way he looked at me then. Guilty, distant, trying to deflect my questions without fully engaging. The more I probed, the more he shut down, until he finally told me it was just a harmless flirtation, nothing serious. But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. It was everything. And yet, I stayed. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the man I loved wasn't capable of betraying me, that the life we had built together was real. But in the quiet of the night, when I was alone with my thoughts, the truth started to seep in. He had already chosen someone else. I wasn't enough. The love I had poured into him, the devotion I had given him, wasn't enough. But I didn't leave. Instead, I buried the pain, telling myself that I could fix it, that I could make it better. I tried to be more understanding, more patient. I tried to ignore the little things that had started to feel off. The late nights at work, the unexplained absences, the coldness in his eyes when he looked at me. I told myself I was being too sensitive, that I needed to be stronger, to give him more space. But the truth was, I had already given him everything, and it still wasn't enough. In the months that followed, I began to notice how little I mattered to him. I would ask how his day went, and he would give me one-word answers. I would suggest spending time together, but he would always have an excuse. The romantic gestures that had once made me feel special had disappeared, replaced by indifference. I started to feel like I was living with a stranger. And then, the ultimate betrayal. He didn't even try to hide it. He came home late one evening, reeking of another woman's perfume. My heart sank as he walked through the door, smiling like nothing was wrong, his eyes avoiding mine. The silence between us was suffocating. I knew. I didn't need to ask. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, barely audible over the pounding in my chest. He hesitated. Then he said the words that would haunt me forever. "It's nothing. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. It was just a fling. You're the one I want." It was the worst kind of lie. A lie wrapped in half-truths, meant to make me feel better while everything was crumbling around me. But I didn't feel better. I felt sick. Sick with the realization that I had been fooled, that I had allowed myself to be treated like this for far too long. And worst of all, I had ignored the signs, hoping that love would fix everything, that love would be enough to make him see me. But love had never been enough. I had never been enough. I stayed for a while longer, convincing myself that I could fix it. I tried to be the perfect partner, the one he had once claimed to want. But each time I reached out, each time I tried to bridge the gap between us, he pulled further away. His affection, his love, had already been given to someone else. That was the moment I realized I was losing myself. I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone willing to put up with lies, with betrayal, with neglect, all in the name of keeping a relationship intact. But I couldn't do it anymore. I had given everything I had, and in return, I had been left with nothing but the painful truth. I wasn't his priority. I never had been. And that's when I made the decision. I chose freedom. I chose to walk away. I chose myself. The moment I walked away from him, I didn't just leave a relationship. I left behind a version of myself. I was no longer the woman who had given everything to someone who could never truly value her. I was no longer the woman who waited in the shadows for validation, for approval, for love that had never been freely given. I didn't know exactly where I was headed, but I knew this much. I couldn't go back. There was no turning around, no going back to the familiar. I spent the first few days in a fog of confusion, trying to figure out what to do with this newfound freedom. For so long, I had defined myself by him, by us. Our future, our life together, had been my focus, and without it, I felt untethered, lost. But in that uncertainty, something incredible began to stir within me, a small spark that had been buried beneath years of emotional exhaustion. I realized that this was my chance to reclaim my life, to become the person I had always been, but had been too afraid to embrace. The first thing I did was stop apologizing for feeling lost. I had spent years apologizing for not being enough, for not meeting his expectations, for not being who he needed me to be. I had silenced my own needs and desires to fit into a mold that had never been mine. But now I needed to make a decision. I needed to embrace the uncertainty and take action, because the only way forward was to choose myself. The first step I took was to disconnect. I had lived so long in a space where I had been constantly plugged into his world, where I had put his needs above my own, where his moods and emotions dictated the rhythm of my day. I had forgotten what it felt like to listen to myself, to follow my own instincts. So, I started small. I turned off my phone, put away my social media, and focused on being alone with my thoughts. It wasn't easy. The impulse to check in, to reach out, to see if he had tried to contact me was strong, but I resisted. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel. I let the sadness wash over me. I let the anger and the grief have their moment. I let myself sit with all the emotions I had pushed down for so long, telling myself that I had to be strong, that I had to hold it together. I realized that strength wasn't about suppressing emotions. It was about acknowledging them and then moving forward, no matter how difficult it seemed. The next step was to take care of myself. In the past, I had sacrificed my health, my well-being, my goals, all in the name of maintaining peace, of making sure I didn't rock the boat. I had ignored my body, ignored my mind, and let stress and exhaustion take their toll. But now I had to focus on healing. I enrolled in a yoga class, something I had always wanted to try but had never had the time for. I began running in the mornings, pushing myself to move through the physical discomfort, knowing that with each step, I was shedding the weight of my past. My body, once neglected, was now my refuge. I didn't just focus on physical health. I also realized that I needed to nurture my mind. I had been so consumed by the relationship, by his needs, that I had neglected my own growth. So, I made it a point to read again, to invest in the things that sparked my creativity, my passion, the things that made me feel alive. I surrounded myself with inspiring people, joined groups, and started taking small steps toward the dreams I had put on hold for so long. But it wasn't just about physical and mental health, it was about reclaiming my independence. For years, I had been dependent on him. His approval, his opinions, had dictated everything I did. I had given up my career aspirations, my personal goals, my hobbies, in exchange for his attention, for his love. Now I had to build myself from the ground up. I began to work on projects that I had always put off. I pursued opportunities that once seemed too distant, too unattainable. I found a new passion for my work, and slowly but surely, I began to rebuild the career that had been sidelined for so long. The more I invested in myself, the more I realized how much I had been missing. I had been so afraid of standing alone, of failing without someone to support me, that I had never fully embraced my own potential. But now I was learning to trust myself, to believe in my ability to create the life I wanted. As I moved forward, I began to see the world with fresh eyes. The relationships I had once prioritized were now being reconsidered. I began to set boundaries with people, cutting ties with those who had enabled my toxic relationship patterns, and surrounding myself with people who respected my choices and supported my growth. I reconnected with old friends, people who had always been there but whom I had pushed aside in the name of my relationship. I made new connections, people who valued me for who I was, not who I was when I was in a relationship with him. The biggest change, however, was my perspective on love. For so long, I had believed that love was about sacrifice, about losing yourself in the other person. But I realized that love was about mutual respect, about partnership. I didn't need someone to complete me. I was already complete. I didn't need to chase love or cling to it for fear of being alone. Instead, I learned that love comes naturally when you are at peace with yourself. It isn't something that should make you feel small or unworthy. It should lift you up, make you feel stronger, more whole. And then came the most profound realization: I didn't need him. I didn't need anyone who didn't see me for who I truly was. I didn't need someone who took my love for granted, who thought I would stay forever because I was too afraid to leave. I had found my strength, and I knew that I could face whatever came next, on my own. The transformation wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy. There were days when I questioned myself, days when I wanted to reach out, to go back to the familiar, but I resisted. With every challenge, I became more sure of myself. The fear of being alone, of being unworthy, slowly faded, and in its place grew something far stronger: confidence, empowerment, and a deep sense of self-worth. I had finally chosen myself, and in doing so, I had found the freedom I had been seeking for so long. As I began to carve out a new life for myself, it didn't take long for the ghosts of my past to reappear. I had expected it, of course. I knew that leaving him wasn't going to be the end of the story. The choice to walk away from a man who thought I would stay forever came with consequences. He wasn't going to just let me go quietly into the night. The first sign of trouble came when he reached out to me. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a heartfelt plea for us to work things out. Number it was a message that showed just how little he understood the gravity of what had happened between us. "I've been thinking," he wrote, "about us, about everything. I know things got messed up, but we can fix it, can't we?" At that moment, I felt something shift within me. There was a brief pang of longing, of the comfort that I had once felt in his presence, of the life we had tried to build together. But it was quickly replaced by something stronger: anger. How dare he think that after everything, I would go back to being the person who had tolerated his lies and his manipulations? How dare he think that I was still the woman who would sacrifice her happiness just to keep him around? I didn't reply to the message. I didn't have to. I had already made my choice, and there was nothing he could say to change it. But that wasn't the end of it. The messages continued, each one more insistent than the last. He tried to guilt me into taking him back, saying things like, "I've made a huge mistake, and I'm not the same person anymore." But the more he tried to manipulate me, the more I realized just how little I actually mattered to him. The same man who had broken my heart, who had put me through so much emotional turmoil, now thought he could fix everything with a few words. The worst part was the way he tried to make me feel responsible for his actions. "You left me," he said in one of his messages, "and now I'm miserable. I'm not asking you to come back, but you should at least acknowledge how hard this is for me." For a moment, I was taken aback. The audacity of it. The way he turned the tables and tried to make me feel like the one in the wrong. I had walked away because I finally realized my worth. But here he was, trying to make me feel guilty for choosing myself. I stared at that message for what felt like an eternity. I had spent so much of my life trying to be the woman who could fix things, who could make everything right. I had always believed that if I just loved hard enough, if I just gave more of myself, it would work. But the reality was, I was the one who had been broken. I was the one who had sacrificed everything, who had neglected myself to please someone who could never truly see me. That was when I decided I needed to take control, not just of my decisions, but of how I allowed him to affect me. I blocked his number. I unfriended him on social media. And I made a firm, unwavering commitment to never go back to the life I had left behind. But even that wasn't enough. The whispers, the rumors, the people who still didn't understand why I had walked away, they started to take a toll on me. I had always been a private person, someone who didn't like to air her dirty laundry. But when I started hearing people talk behind my back, when I saw mutual friends questioning my decision, I realized something important. It wasn't my responsibility to explain myself to anyone. Still, the temptation to justify my actions was there. The part of me that had been afraid of being misunderstood, of being judged, wanted to give everyone an explanation, but I refused. I refused to let anyone else define my choices. I refused to let anyone else make me second-guess the decision that had been so hard to make. As the days turned into weeks, I started to feel the weight of the emotional toll that his attempts to pull me back had taken. There were moments when I felt lonely, when I doubted myself, when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. The voice inside my head whispered, "What if you made a mistake? What if you'll regret leaving him?" It was easy to fall back into old patterns, to let self-doubt creep in and cloud my judgment. But then I remembered why I had left in the first place: the pain, the lies, the constant feeling of not being enough. I reminded myself that I wasn't going back to that. I wasn't going to be the person who lived in fear, the person who waited for someone else to give her permission to be happy. And then came the most unexpected of challenges. his new relationship. It was one thing for him to try to get me back with his empty promises, but it was another thing entirely to watch him move on so quickly, to see him with someone else. Part of me felt like I was being replaced, as if all the love I had given him was now being given to someone else without any effort. It made me feel small, insignificant, as though my presence in his life had never mattered. But as I watched him move on, something in me clicked. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes. I wasn't angry. I wasn't jealous. I was free. I saw that the woman he had moved on with didn't define me. She didn't take away my worth. In fact, her presence in his life made me realize just how far I had come. I wasn't the woman he had manipulated. I wasn't the woman who had spent years doubting her own worth. I was stronger than that. His moving on didn't mean I had failed. It meant that I had finally succeeded. I had gotten out. I had chosen myself. And nothing, not even his quick rebound, could take that away from me. The final confrontation came when he showed up at my door, his face full of desperation, trying once again to pull me back into his world. His eyes pleaded with me, but there was no more room for him in my life, no more second chances. I had given him enough. I had given myself enough. No, I said firmly, as I stood there in the doorway, my heart calm for the first time in years. I'm not coming back. I'm not the woman you thought would always stay. I am choosing freedom now, and I'm not looking back. His face fell, but I didn't feel the sting of regret. I didn't feel the sadness I once would have felt at seeing his disappointment. Instead, I felt something stronger. Pride. I had stood my ground. I had found my peace. And in that moment, I knew that nothing could take away the freedom I had earned. The moment I finally closed the door on Ethan and his manipulations, a deep sense of relief washed over me. I didn't need to wait for his apology or validation anymore. The truth had settled in. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first walked away. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up, and I had learned to trust in my own strength. My life was no longer dictated by his choices or the role I had once played in his story. It was mine, and I was the author. But even though I had reached this place of peace, the echoes of my past still lingered. They didn't vanish overnight, and I knew that I wasn't done. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. But the beginning was no longer filled with fear. The uncertainty that once paralyzed me had transformed into a quiet sense of purpose. I had already begun to make changes, real, tangible changes. I had reclaimed my career, which had been sidelined for far too long. The drive I had once lost in the haze of the toxic relationship had come back, and I was pushing myself harder than I ever had before. I was no longer afraid of failure. In fact, I was learning to embrace it as part of the journey. I was finding new opportunities, taking on challenges that once felt impossible, and doing so with a quiet confidence that came from knowing my worth. But it wasn't just my career. It was my entire life that had shifted. The woman I had been, lost in the shadows of someone else's desires, was gone. The new woman that had emerged was unapologetically herself, and she wasn't afraid to take up space, to claim her worth, to demand the life she had always deserved. As I began to see the changes around me, I noticed how different my relationships with others had become. I was no longer the person who apologized for having needs. I wasn't the person who shrank into the background, afraid of asserting myself. The people in my life who truly cared about me, my friends, my family, supported me with an understanding that wasn't based on pity or expectations. They saw the transformation in me, and they embraced it. I had begun to see myself not through the lens of my past mistakes, but through the strength I had cultivated, the lessons I had learned. The greatest shift, however, was within me. I no longer saw myself as a victim. I had been hurt, yes, but I had chosen to rise above it. I wasn't the girl who had been swept up in a toxic relationship, hoping for love that was never fully given. I wasn't the girl who had waited around for someone else to change. I had done the hard work, the painful work, and had emerged stronger and more whole than I had ever been. And that was when the ultimate change occurred. I realized that I had already won. Ethan thought I would stay forever. He thought I would be the one to always forgive, to always give him a second chance, to always wait for him to choose me. But I had chosen myself instead. I had walked away, not because I had given up, but because I had learned the hard truth. I didn't need him. Not for validation, not for love, not for anything. I thought back to the days when I had lived in the shadows, when I had sacrificed my own happiness for someone else's. I thought about the moments when I had convinced myself that I wasn't enough, that I had to be perfect for him to love me. And I realized that all of that had been a lie. The only thing I had ever needed to be was myself. And that was enough. It wasn't always easy, of course. There were days when the temptation to look back, to reach out, to slip into old patterns, was overwhelming. There were nights when I cried, when I questioned whether I had made the right choice. But with each passing day, I became more certain of my decision. I became more certain of who I was becoming. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, truly living, for the first time in a long while. And then came the moment when I received the apology I never expected. It wasn't the grand gesture I had once imagined. There were no tears, no desperate pleas for forgiveness. It was simple. A message. Just a few words. I'm sorry for everything. I know I hurt you. I didn't deserve you. I stared at the message for a long time, reading the words over and over. A part of me wanted to respond, to tell him how much he had hurt me, how much damage his actions had caused. But I didn't. Instead, I let the message sit in my inbox, knowing that it didn't change anything. His apology didn't change the fact that I had already moved on. It didn't change the fact that I had already healed. What struck me, though, was how far I had come. In the past, an apology from him would have made me second-guess everything I had worked so hard for. I would have questioned myself, wondering if I had made the right decision. But now I realized that I didn't need his apology to validate my worth. I had already found peace within myself, and so I deleted the message. In that moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had finally let go of the past. I had let go of the version of me that had been defined by someone else's choices, by someone else's actions. I had chosen myself. And in that choice, I had found the freedom I had been seeking for so long. It wasn't just about revenge or proving a point. It was about understanding my own value, my own strength. It was about realizing that my happiness, my future, was not in someone else's hands. I had the power to shape it, to create it, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that power away from me. And as I moved forward, I felt a deep, unwavering peace settle within me. I had achieved everything I needed to, not because of him, but because of the woman I had become. I was no longer defined by my past mistakes, by the things I had endured. I was defined by my choices, my strength, and my ability to rise above. It's strange how time works. When I first walked away, everything felt like it was falling apart. The life I thought I had, the future I had imagined, none of it seemed possible anymore. The road ahead was uncertain, full of fear and doubt. But now, looking back, I realize that those moments of pain, those moments of struggle, were the very things that led me to this place. A place where I could finally breathe, where I could finally feel like myself again. In the months that followed, I started to see the world differently. What once felt like a dark tunnel now seemed like a path filled with possibility. The strength I had always sought outside of myself, the validation I had once craved, was already inside me. I had discovered a version of myself that was capable of so much more than I had ever imagined. The woman who once depended on someone else for her happiness, for her sense of self-worth, had been replaced by someone who knew her value. I had stopped seeking approval from others, from him, or from anyone who didn't truly understand me. The need to prove myself to anyone had dissipated, and in its place was an overwhelming sense of peace. I had nothing to prove, because I knew, deep down, that I was enough. It wasn't just the external changes that defined me now, it was the internal transformation. I had learned to love myself. I had learned to forgive myself. I had spent so many years being afraid of what others thought of me, afraid of making mistakes, of being judged. But now I understood that I didn't need anyone else's validation to be happy. I could stand on my own, with my head held high, knowing that I was the one who had shaped my life, my future. I had started a new chapter, one that didn't rely on the old narrative of my life. I was no longer the woman defined by a relationship, by a love that was never meant to last. I was the woman who had risen from the ashes, who had found her strength in the most unlikely place, within herself. My career had blossomed. What had once been a distant dream was now a reality. I had rediscovered my passion, my purpose, and I poured myself into it with everything I had. I was no longer the person who waited for opportunities to come to her. I created them. I took risks that once would have terrified me, and with each step I took, I felt a surge of confidence, knowing that I was exactly where I was meant to be. But even more than professional success, I found joy in the simple things, the quiet moments I once overlooked, the mornings spent reading a book I loved, the evenings spent alone, reflecting on how far I had come. Those became the moments I cherished the most. I had learned to find happiness in my own company, to enjoy the peace that came from being alone with my thoughts. I had built a life that was mine, and I was proud of it. I wasn't waiting for anyone else to complete me. I was already whole. The person I had once been, the person who thought love was all about sacrifice, about losing yourself for someone else, was gone. In her place stood a woman who was unapologetically herself, someone who had learned that love, true love, started with self-love. It was only when I let go of the past that I began to realize how much I had been holding on to. The anger, the bitterness, the resentment. I had carried them with me for far too long, letting them weigh me down. But when I finally forgave myself, when I finally accepted that I had made the best decision I could at the time, those feelings melted away. I was free, and in that freedom, I found peace. The world around me had changed too. The people who truly cared about me, who respected me for who I was, stood by my side. Those who had doubted me, who had questioned my decision to leave him, slowly faded into the background. I didn't need them in my life anymore. I surrounded myself with those who lifted me up, who believed in me, and who supported me as I moved forward. The relationships I had now were built on mutual respect and understanding, not on fear or dependency. And then, unexpectedly, love found its way back into my life. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the desperate, clingy love I had once known. It wasn't a love that required me to lose myself in order to make the other person happy. Number. This love was equal. It was grounded. It was a partnership. I didn't need this person to validate me. I didn't need them to complete me. We were two whole people choosing each other. Not because we were broken, but because we were already whole. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. but it was real. It was a love that respected boundaries, that embraced individuality, that allowed us both to grow. And for the first time, I realized that this was what love was supposed to be. It wasn't about finding someone to save you. It was about finding someone who saw you, who understood you, who loved you for all that you were. I had come full circle. The woman who had once been afraid of being alone, who had desperately clung to a love that wasn't hers to keep, had learned that her worth didn't depend on anyone else's approval. She had learned that her happiness, her peace, was her own responsibility. And as I stood at the crossroads of my future, I realized something profound. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I was living a life that was true to me. I had chosen freedom, and in that choice, I had found everything I had ever needed. The journey hadn't been easy. It hadn't been without pain, without moments of doubt. But every step, every tear, every challenge had led me here, to this moment of peace, to this life I had built with my own hands. And as I looked ahead, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. Because I had learned that the only thing that truly mattered was the choice to live for myself.